Welcome to the Vintage Vibe. No, I haven't had too much to drink tonight. In fact, this is a family-friendly channel in case you didn't know, so we're gonna have a pop instead. Now you can grab your favorite beverage and pull a seat up because we're going behind the scenes tonight on the Vintage Vibe, where I'll show you a few things. Well, kind of share with you what happens before things happen. I've actually got a piece right now on the bench, which I'll bring you over to next and take a peek at. I think you'll really dig it. It's a cool piece. Looking forward to getting it upstairs and giving it a good listen. Also show you a couple pieces that I'm going to say are in the vault, which are just kind of waiting to rotate back into use. I've probably got 30 or 40 hours worth of videos just to kind of splice together. I'm old school. It takes me a while to do this stuff, so my apologies and thanks for bearing with me. I'll show you a couple pieces that you know, are kind of near and dear to me, as well as a couple oddities, some oddballs that are just better, you know, left unexplained. You take a peek at them, you decide what you think of them. Only here on the Vintage Vibe. Okay, here's our first piece. This is a Denon PMA-8500II Mark II. This, I think, is a real beautiful amplifier. It's very utilitarian looking. It probably wasn't the most popular looking, quite frankly, in the day because it didn't sell too well. And in fact, you probably didn't see many of these, if any of these, in North America. Now this is the Mark II version, which is the more rare of you know, the siblings, for lack of better words. And what made this one so special is a switch kind of at the front here. I'll zoom in and show you. We have a Class A mode switch, which allows us to operate up to about 10 watts per channel in pure Class A. Now it also has you know, all the typical 1970s features, and one you wouldn't expect, which is right here, the direct couple switch. Now when that's engaged, that actually will reduce the output by about 10 dB. Originally I thought it was a DC mode for the amplifier, and usually in DC mode you get a wider kind of frequency response, like 0 hertz to 100,000 hertz type of thing. But no, this actually decouples the tone circuit. So this is really one of the earliest forms of a bypass switch, a direct switch, or as Pioneer called it, a pure direct switch. And I think Sony called it a pure switch that I've seen in one of these, you know, integrated amplifiers. So this is a real, you know, kind of neat unit, I think, anyways. And right here you can kind of see in the picture up top why I think it's so cool. And you can see inside it is an absolute tank. And in one of our upcoming videos, I'll show you the cleanup of this guy here. Okay, now for some tools of the trade. We've got here on the bench, kind of as you'd expect, a little pair of testing speakers that we can hook up to an amplifier. As well as up top, we've got a little chip amp. This is a SMSL chip amp. It's kind of like, you know, your toppings and all that sort of stuff that are out there. Very similar early chip amp. It's got a little 12 watt by 12 watt Class D amplifier. And it really is kind of cool sounding on full range speakers. And I use it sometimes for testing speakers down here, as well as just background music. Down below there, an old 1950s RCA Victor clock radio, and it still does work. Definitely could use a recapping by now. We've got a capacitance tester, analog multimeter, digital multimeter, a little signal generator, which I really don't use, selection of tubes and resistors and caps, as well as over here a section just with all bulbs and fuses that we keep inside this little drawer. Our step-down transformer and solders. Generally speaking, I use MG chemicals for you know, our cleaners, as well as deoxit for other things. And over here we've got a little dim bulb tester, as well as a little air cleaner that we can run when we're doing some soldering. In the back corner here, we've got a Bic beam box, and this is a little electronically directable FM antenna. Helps kind of get the stations in clear down here in the basement, which is sometimes a challenge. And up top is actually a little bare speaker and amplifier switcher. So you can switch between two amplifiers on the fly and two different pairs of speakers, which is great again for testing, A/Bing, as well as doing some repairs. Finally, you know, our soldering irons. Everyone's got to have a soldering iron if you're working on vintage gear. I typically use a corded iron, 20 and 40 watt kind of selection, as well as this guy here, which is a little lithium ion battery in it, and I think that's what you call it anyways. And this is a little cordless one, so it's great to kind of get into those tight spots and get the job done. And this right here is an Onkyo A8500. This is part of the Integra series, and this was my first higher end amplifier. A little unique story with this one, I'll tell you about in a second. But this amplifier uses a low impedance drive circuit. It's all discrete inside, and it has kind of 4 block separate construction, a nice big anti-electromagnetic interference transformer. As you can see, this thing is still in pretty much mint condition. This would have been about circa 1987, 1988. And this is actually my very first CD player, and it's still working. This is a Kenwood MultiDisc changer. It has dual DA converters. It's a 1-bit type chipset in it. And I'm telling you, if this thing could speak, it's played pretty much almost everything. And it's been with me through thick and thin, back when I used to try to do some DJing, as well as from house to house over the year. It's just been kind of old, reliable. So what is the story behind this old Integra? Now in the early 80s I had my very first component stereo system. It was a Technique system, and it was a super bass loading series. So super bass loading in the amplifier, super bass speakers, double cassette deck, record player. I mean, this was, it was, I don't know, it was probably the most profound purchase I made as a young guy. Saved up for it, excited to get it. Man, I love that stereo. Now, I came from having a boom box, so this was a big step up. As I got a little older as a teen, I got into car audio, and I had a pair of 10-inch subs in 2 enclosures that I brought into the bedroom, and I decided to wire with the Techniques, having no clue about the difference between parallel and series, and I loaded that amplifier down. Now, I did attach to it a couple passive crossovers to get rid of the high frequency, but I ran that amplifier on such a probably 0 to 1 ohm that I blew it sky high. So this actually was an amplifier that one of my brother's friends had. It was less than a year old. I bought it off of him, basically pristine and new, and I've had it ever since. It's a nostalgic piece, so there's no reason to sell it. It definitely does need a restoration, I would say. It's starting to age. Now, these are great amplifiers if you're looking for a vintage type amp on the cheap. Again, it's not 70s silver era vintage, but this late 80s stuff, there were some decent products, particularly the Integra line. They used all Muse capacitors in them, so higher end capacitors as well too. So this would be one to keep your eye on if you are looking. Actually, any Integra series out of the late 80s are pretty decent amplifiers. Now, you might have noticed these guys in the background. Again, these are by no means super desirable speakers. They are, in my opinion, pretty darn good looking speakers. They are super bass loading. They've got kind of a cone within a cone, which is a really neat kind of design. And they're a 3-way speaker, little diffraction horn like you see on JBLs, little circuit protection, and I guess that's probably like a 4.5-inch mid-range driver on it as well too. They probably the biggest downfall to these speakers are the cabinets. They're pretty lightweight. They don't really stand the knuckle wrap test. They're quite hollow sounding, in fact. But they, again, are a nostalgic piece. My father's, I always kind of remember these speakers being up on the mantle, and well, he doesn't want big speakers anymore in the house, so they found their way down here to the vintage vibe. We use I use a VPI 16.5 record cleaning machine. Now, these are probably about $700-800 new, at least they were when I purchased it. About $500 used on the market. It's pretty common. And basically it has a platter, put your record on top. You have a switch here for forward motion of the record. And then you have a switch here for vacuum, which once you put a solution on it, this little wand will drop down and suck the solution, the clean solution, off the actual record. And these are a great investment if you do have a vinyl collection. Certainly better than doing it by hand, and you know, be able to kind of get the maximum fidelity out of your records as well as help protect them for years. So in this section over here, I've got a little setup for some background music, and that's one of our little vault pieces. It's a Sansui 2000A stereo receiver. And this little guy here has been fully restored, completely recapped, and it has a very similar sound to, let's say, a Marantz 2220 or 2230. Being a capacitor coupled receiver, it's quite warm, but this little guy here has a different kind of lively dynamics to it. It is a real keeper. And again, this is a pretty straightforward receiver. Not a lot of features, but just a whole lot of good sound. Right down below from the Sansui, we have a model 5030B Marantz tape deck. This is a 3-head tape deck. This is again a real keeper. This is a high-performing tape deck out of the 1970s. Again, not on par with something like a Nakamichi 1000 Tri-Tracer, but this is, it's got the look, it's got the sound, and these are really becoming quite desirable and more expensive to get your hands on today. These are commonly selling for about 500 Canadian right now, so get your hands on one before it's too late. Now I do have here a pair of full range metronomes, we call them. They're very similar to a transmission line speaker, and it's using this whole tapered horn with a port down below at the very bottom. No crossovers, just some silver wiring inside, nice binding posts, and they use a Fostech driver, a full range driver, which really is something that I recommend everybody tries at one point. Just a full range driver, just for the simplicity in music, particularly if you listen to some jazz or just some basic ensembles. It is a real treat to listen to. And this is something you don't see every day. This is a Pioneer 8-track stereo cassette deck. I guess we really can't call it a cassette. It's just an 8-track stereo deck. And unfortunately, I have no 8 tracks to test it with. I would love to hear from you out there if anyone is using an 8-track to tell me just how bad they sound or whether or not they're palatable. But this is at very least a cool conversation piece. That's why we still have it down here in the Vibe. And it looks really cool besides a SX series receiver. Okay, so now we're going to go take a peek in the other room at a couple other pieces down here hidden in the vault. Come on with me. And this guy right here is a Marantz champagne face 2230 receiver. This is the rare kind of early production units. There's not too many of these out here. It's been fully recapped top to bottom, and it is a sweet sounding receiver, just like that Sansui, capacitor coupled. It is just one of those pieces that, again, if you're going to hunt down a Marantz, a 2230 is definitely one to listen to, or to at least give it a chance. This is one I'll likely never sell just because it is that good sounding. And it just embodies, in my opinion, everything vintage. And this guy here is an FT101 A E2'd Magnum Dynalab tuner. Now I love the Magnum Dynalab pieces, and this one is no exception. It is a newer version of the FT101, just before they probably stopped production of them, and we use this down here kind of in the rec room to match up with the Marantz. Now you might remember this guy from a very early episode on the Vintage Vibe. We didn't do a review of it or anything like that, but this is an old German console radio, and it uses EL84 tubes, which is common for a lot of these German pieces. These German consoles, in my opinion, had very sweet sound. They were probably one of the very best sounding radios or stereo type console units out of the era. And still today, there is something to be said for the EL84 in these German consoles, as well as the speakers that they use. They kind of look like a car audio speaker, like a 6x9 style type speaker that's in here. And they have also speakers on the side firing outwards as well too. But this is a real sweet piece waiting to be restored here still on the Vibe. And this right here is again a console type unit, and it actually is an old RCA radio that somebody had modified and literally cut the top off of it, installing a cabinet kind of lid to it, which is kind of neat, I think, and repurpose it. If we can get the hold open here, and I'm going to show you what's inside of it. This is one of those unusual pieces I want to share with you, and inside they installed a Marantz 2220 receiver, which maybe we'll talk about on another episode, how exactly these ones sound compared to the 2230s. And they put beside it a dual 1225 record player. Inside the cabinet itself in the bottom, there's some Dalquist speakers that were put in the bottommost 6.5 inch woofers, as well as some tweeters that came out of a pair of DB Plus tower speakers. And interestingly enough, the combination of all of this together gives you a very rich, sweet sound and just a oh so cool vintage vibe look. Now we've moved this piece upstairs, so we're no longer down in the basement, so I'm kind of cheating, but I just want to show you this because this came out of the vault. This is a Sansui AU-111 stereo integrated amplifier. I think this is an absolutely stunning piece. It really marks, I think, Sansui's pinnacle in tube amp design, and I can't wait to share with you more about my opinions of this unit when we do a review up and coming on the Vintage Vibe. And here's another really interesting vault piece. This guy here is a Mitsubishi linear tracking turntable. This is called the LT5V. And again, another piece that I've had kind of sitting aside here on the Vintage Vibe. And if I can just remember how to open it. See, that's how long it's been sitting. So the record gets put in as such, and this, I'll call it a clamp, holds it in place, and then the arm kind of linear tracks across the actual table. As we switch it there, you can see the power lights up on it. And again, this arm will just kind of glide right across the record. Very, very interesting turntable. I think this is one of those pieces that stands the test of time design-wise. And finally out here to a workspace in the garage that we use in the summer. And I've got set up kind of a workbench here with a computer monitor to look at some manuals online, compressor on the ground to clean out the inside of amplifiers, a little Denon receiver up here to be able to test speakers like these guys right here, which are one of the sets I want to show you today, which I thought are kind of unique and interesting pieces. These are OpenBaffle speakers, so they have no backs to them really. They're just open to interact with the environment, and they are configured in an array, which means we've got 9 mid-tweeters, which are JVC branded mid-tweeters, a pair of Yamaha woofers in the middle, which actually do the lower bass, interestingly enough, whereas the huge 16-inch Sansui woofers are actually more mid-bass, and that's kind of how they're crossed over. Now I've got one blown mid-tweeter in there right now, which is up top. These would have came out of a 1980s JVC boombox, and believe it or not, these speakers are fairly desirable. They're from their 150 and 200 series boomboxes, and the actual mid-driver, or the woofer that they would have used, is infused with ceramic, interestingly enough. So right now the backs are apart, because we've got a blown driver. And you can see the crossovers are kind of right now a hot mess, but we're working away on them to try to get them back up and running. And then I'll get a chance to give them a really good listen and report back to you here on the Vintage Vibe. Well, I hope you enjoyed coming behind the scenes and taking a sneak peek at a few pieces that I'm currently working on and getting ready to share with you on a later episode on the Vintage Vibe. Now, I wish that I got to keep all this stuff, but really there's only about 2 or 3 pieces in the Vintage Vault at any given time. Everything else really just reunites itself with other people that are just as crazy about audio as me and you. Now, the great news about that is it allows me time and more resources to hunt down, find, repair, and review more vintage audio and share it with you here on the Vibe. So if you're enjoying what you see, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.